All right, today we're going to break down a pretty detailed biblical case against celebrating modern Christmas. Now, this isn't just a random opinion. It comes from a source that's directly refuting a popular defense of the holiday, and it claims that whole defense is built on a major misunderstanding of Scripture. So let's see how they build their case. Right off the bat, you can see the fundamental clash. On one side, you have the common view. Christmas is totally fine as long as your heart is in the right place, right? But on the other side, there's this argument that biblical worship has nothing to do with our sincerity. It's all about following God's specific commands. This is the core disagreement we're going to unpack. So here's our game plan. We'll start with that fundamental disagreement, and then we'll deconstruct some of the common defenses for Christmas. After that, we're going to look at the golden calf incident as a key parallel, examine a broader biblical pattern of prohibition, and finally land on the source's ultimate verdict. Okay, first up, the fundamental disagreement. The source kicks things off by claiming the entire defense of Christmas starts with what it calls a category error. Basically, that the whole argument puts the holiday in the wrong box from the very beginning because it misunderstands what the Bible actually calls idolatry. So this is the idea the source really pushes back on. The common defense seems to work from this really narrow definition of idolatry. You know, the really extreme stuff. The thinking goes, well, we're not doing human sacrifice, so it can't possibly be idolatry. But the source argues that the Bible's definition is actually much, much broader. And this is where it gets really interesting. The source broadens the whole definition of what counts as improper worship. It points to Nadab and Abihu. They were judged not for worshiping a false god, but for offering unauthorized fire to the true God. And, crucially, the golden calf was declared a feast to Yahweh, the personal name for the God of Israel. The big takeaway here is that inventing your own way to worship God is condemned, even if your intentions are totally pure. In our next section, we're going to see how the source claims specific Bible verses are misused to defend Christmas, and they start with a really popular one from the book of Jeremiah. Okay, so you've probably heard this one. The passage in Jeremiah 10 describes people cutting down a tree and decorating it to create a carved idol they can worship. And defenders of Christmas correctly point out that this isn't exactly what's happening with a modern Christmas tree, but according to the source, this is where a huge logical leap happens. And that's the logical leap the source calls a major error. The argument goes that just because one specific passage about idol trees doesn't perfectly match a modern Christmas tree, well, that doesn't automatically give the whole practice a biblical green light. According to the source, this whole thing reveals a completely different principle for worship. See, the logic isn't if it's not forbidden, it's allowed. It's actually the opposite. Only what is commanded is allowed. They point to verses that stress making everything according to the pattern that God himself provides. In this view, the absence of a no is absolutely not the same as a yes. Okay, now we get to what the source calls its controlling text. The one story in the Bible it claims completely refutes the idea that sincere, man-made worship is acceptable to God. The golden calf. The source argues this story isn't about the Israelites deciding to worship some foreign god, it's about them inventing how they would worship their own god, YHWH. Look at the direct parallel the source is drawing on this slide. In both cases, the name being used is the correct one. The activity is a feast to that god, and the intent is to worship the very God who saved them. The source argues that the underlying structure here is identical, a man-made celebration meant to honor the true God. And what was the biblical outcome of this sincere but unauthorized feast? Well, according to Exodus, 3,000 people died. The source uses this number to hammer home just how seriously Scripture treats the act of inventing your own forms of worship. This idea then builds into a much wider pattern. The source argues that the problem with man-made holy days isn't just a one-off thing. It claims there's a consistent principle at play, and we can actually see it by looking at how the Bible talks about birthdays. This is a really fascinating point. According to the source, the Bible never, not once, commands anyone to celebrate a birthday. In fact, every time a birthday party is mentioned, it's tied to something pretty grim. You've got Pharaoh's birthday, which ends in an execution. Herod's birthday ends with the murder of John the Baptist, and even Job curses the day he was born. There's just no positive example to follow. So all of this brings us to the formal definition that holds this entire argument together. From this point of view, unauthorized worship is any religious practice you attach to God that he has not specifically commanded in Scripture. The key word there is authorization. It has to come from God, not from human innovation. And here's the verse the source holds up as the clear rulebook for worship. Deuteronomy 12:32. What I command you, observe to do it. Do not add or take from it. It's argued that this principle leaves zero room for human creativity or tradition when it comes to worship. Okay, so let's pull all this together for the final verdict. This last section is all about making the source's core objection to Christmas crystal clear, because it claims this is the point that almost everyone misunderstands. And this is probably the most crucial distinction in the entire argument. The source is not arguing that Christmas is wrong because of some pagan origins. That's a whole different debate. The error from this perspective is that Christmas is an unauthorized, man-made religious holiday. The issue isn't where the traditions came from, it's the lack of a biblical command to do it at all. So from this theological framework, Christmas falls into the exact same category of error as the golden calf and the unauthorized fire of Nadab and Abihu. It's a man-made invention that's presented as worship. And according to the source, that's a category error, even if your theology is correct and your heart is sincere. Which brings us to the provocative question at the heart of this entire analysis. When you take all these texts together, from the golden calf to Deuteronomy, is sincere human invention a biblically valid form of worship? The source presents a very clear text-driven no, and that leaves a pretty profound challenge to a centuries-old tradition.